Officer Daniel Mercer had worked the downtown district for nearly 8 years, long enough to know its rhythms. Friday afternoons were always unpredictable. Office workers flooded the sidewalks, street vendors lined the corners, and traffic crawled through narrow intersections like a restless tide. The city never truly slowed down, it simply shifted pace. Mercer leaned back slightly in the passenger seat of the patrol vehicle, scanning storefront reflections through his sunglasses. His uniform was pressed sharply, badge polished, posture confident. To most people in the district, he was a familiar presence. Direct, assertive, efficient. He believed in control, in setting the tone before anyone else could. In his mind, hesitation invited chaos. Behind the wheel sat Officer Luis Ortega, newer to the precinct but observant and steady. Ortega preferred to listen more than speak, watching situations unfold before stepping in. He respected Mercer's experience, though he sometimes questioned the speed at which his partner escalated minor issues. A call crackled through the radio, suspected shoplifting at a convenience store 2 blocks ahead. The dispatcher's tone was routine, nothing urgent. Mercer straightened immediately. "Let's move," he said, tapping the dashboard lightly. Ortega nodded and eased the patrol car into traffic. When they arrived, the scene was already forming. A store manager stood outside, gripping a young man by the sleeve while arguing loudly. A small crowd had gathered, curious pedestrians slowing their steps, some already raising phones discreetly. Mercer stepped out first, boots striking pavement with authority. His presence alone shifted the energy. "What's going on?" he demanded, voice firm but controlled. The manager launched into explanation, missing merchandise, suspicious behavior, refusal to cooperate. The accused, a nervous teenager in a worn hoodie, denied everything. His voice trembled, eyes darting between the officer and the growing crowd. Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. He had seen this pattern countless times. Denial, excuses, escalation. He took a step closer to the teenager, narrowing the distance intentionally. "Empty your pockets," he ordered. Ortega remained just behind, observing. He noticed the boy's hands shake as he complied. A pack of gum and a crumpled receipt fell to the sidewalk. No stolen merchandise appeared. The manager's confidence faltered, but Mercer didn't immediately step back. Instead, he shifted his gaze to the crowd. That's when he noticed him. A well-dressed man stood several feet away, composed and attentive. Mid-30s, tailored blazer, polished shoes. He wasn't shouting or interfering. He was simply watching calmly, steadily. A phone rested casually at his side, not hidden, not obvious, but ready. Mercer felt a subtle irritation stir. He didn't like being observed during active enforcement. It felt like silent judgment. "Show's over," Mercer called out sharply to the crowd. "Keep moving." Most obeyed, dispersing with reluctant curiosity. But the well-dressed man remained. He didn't argue. He didn't move. He simply met Mercer's eyes with a measured, unreadable expression. For a brief moment, the street felt quieter despite the traffic noise. Mercer held the man's gaze a second longer than necessary. Something about his composure felt deliberate, controlled. Mercer turned back to the teenager, finishing the interaction with a warning rather than an arrest. The store manager muttered dissatisfaction but backed down. The immediate situation seemed resolved. Yet as Mercer walked back toward the patrol car, he could feel the lingering presence of that calm observer, and something in him bristled at the idea that this routine stop might not be as ordinary as it first appeared. The crowd thinned, but the well-dressed man didn't move. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed that immediately. Most people avoided eye contact. Once police attention shifted toward them, they stepped back, pretended to check their phones, or crossed the street entirely. But this man remained exactly where he was, calm, upright, composed. Mercer closed the patrol car door slowly, eyes locking onto him again. "You got somewhere to be?" Mercer called out. voice firm but edged with challenge. The man stepped forward just enough to be heard clearly, without raising his voice. "I'm already where I need to be, officer." His tone wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't aggressive. It was measured. Mercer didn't like that. "What were you recording?" Mercer asked, nodding toward the phone resting loosely in the man's hand. "Public interaction," the man replied evenly. "Nothing more." Ortega shifted slightly beside the patrol car, sensing the tension sharpening. "It's a public sidewalk," Ortega added carefully, not challenging Mercer, just stating fact. Mercer ignored him. "You interfering?" Mercer pressed. "No," the man answered. "Just observing." Again, calm. That calmness was starting to feel like resistance. "What's your name?" Mercer asked. The man hesitated, not nervously, but deliberately. "Marcus Reed." E to Marcus. Marcus didn't move immediately. He held Mercer's gaze, then glanced briefly at Ortega before returning his attention to Mercer. "Am I being detained?" Marcus asked. The question was direct, controlled, not confrontational, just precise. Mercer stepped closer, closing the physical space between them. "You don't ask the questions here." "With respect," Marcus said quietly. "I'm asking for clarification." A few pedestrians slowed again. Sensing something brewing, a woman across the street lifted her phone higher. Traffic continued moving, unaware that tension was rising on the sidewalk. Mercer felt the pressure of eyes on him, that familiar sensation of being watched, judged. "Hand me your ID," Mercer repeated. Marcus reached into his jacket slowly. His movements were smooth, intentional, no sudden gestures. He removed a wallet but kept it closed in his hand. "Before I provide identification," Marcus said, "I need to understand the reason." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You were recording an active investigation. A warning conversation," Marcus corrected calmly. "The individual was not arrested." Ortega glanced between them. He could see the shift happening, Mercer's posture stiffening, shoulders rising slightly. "This is obstruction," Mercer said. "It isn't," Marcus replied evenly. "But if you believe it is, I'd like that stated clearly." That did it. Mercer reached forward and grabbed Marcus's forearm, not violently, but firmly enough to assert control. "I'm stating it clearly now." The crowd reacted audibly. A murmur passed through bystanders. Phones were fully raised now. Marcus did not resist. He looked down at Mercer's grip, then back up at his face. No anger, no panic, just focus. "Officer," Marcus said quietly, "this isn't necessary." But Mercer had already made his decision. "You're being detained pending investigation." Ortega stepped forward slightly. "Daniel, I've got it," Mercer snapped. Marcus allowed himself to be turned toward the patrol car. His phone remained in his other hand, camera still facing outward. As Mercer guided him forward, Marcus spoke one more sentence low enough that only Mercer could clearly hear it. "Are you certain this is how you want this to proceed?" Mercer didn't answer. He only tightened his grip. And somewhere beneath the surface of that routine downtown patrol, something had just shifted permanently. The moment Mercer tightened his grip, the energy on the sidewalk changed. What had started as a routine stop now carried weight. People who had begun to walk away slowed again. A delivery driver paused beside his van. Two college students stood frozen mid-step, phones raised openly now. Marcus Reed did not resist. That, more than anything, unsettled Mercer. Most people argued. They pulled back. They demanded explanations louder. Marcus did none of that. He allowed himself to be turned toward the patrol car, posture steady, breathing controlled. "Place your hands on the hood," Mercer ordered. Marcus complied immediately, setting his phone down carefully on the hood before placing both palms flat against the metal surface. Ortega stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Daniel, we've got no charge here." "He was interfering," Mercer replied sharply. "He was standing there. He was recording. That's not illegal. Mercer shot Ortega, a look that ended the conversation. Authority, in Mercer's mind, depended on decisiveness. Doubt invited disorder. Behind them, someone called out, "He wasn't doing anything." Mercer ignored it. He began a quick pat-down, movements brisk and efficient. Marcus remained silent. "You carrying anything I should know about?" Mercer asked. "No," Marcus answered evenly. "Any weapons?" "No." Mercer felt nothing unusual during the search, just a wallet, a phone, keys. No threat, no contraband. Yet backing down now felt impossible. "Turn around," Mercer instructed. Marcus did. Their eyes met again. Up close, Mercer could see there was no fear in Marcus's expression. No anger either, just a steady, analytical calm. It felt like being evaluated. "Why were you recording?" Mercer demanded again. "For documentation," Marcus replied. "Documentation of what?" "Officer conduct." The words were neutral, but they landed heavily. Mercer felt heat rise under his collar. "You accusing me of something?" "I haven't accused you of anything, but you're documenting." "Yes." "Why?" Marcus paused just long enough to be noticeable. "Because transparency matters." That answer didn't de-escalate. It sharpened everything. Mercer reached for his handcuffs. Ortega stepped forward again. "Daniel, think about this." "I am thinking. You're escalating. I am controlling the situation." Marcus spoke quietly. "Officer, I am not resisting." Mercer snapped one cuff around Marcus's wrist. The metallic click echoed louder than it should have. The crowd reacted gasps, murmurs, someone saying, "This is crazy." Ortega glanced around, realizing at least 5 different phones were recording clearly now. "You're being detained for obstruction," Mercer stated firmly, though the justification sounded thinner the second time he said it. Marcus looked down briefly at the cuff around his wrist, then back at Mercer. "For the record," Marcus said calmly, "I am complying." The second cuff locked into place. Another click. Irreversible. Mercer guided Marcus toward the patrol car, opening the rear door. Before placing him inside, Mercer leaned closer. "You think you're smarter than everyone else?" he muttered under his breath. Marcus met his eyes without flinching. "No," he said quietly. "I think you're moving too fast." Mercer shut the door. The sound of it closing felt heavier than it should have. Across the street, someone whispered, "This is going to blow up." Ortega stood still for a moment, watching the reflection of the flashing patrol lights ripple across nearby storefront windows. He had a feeling this wasn't about a bystander anymore, and whatever line had just been crossed, it wasn't going to uncross itself. The patrol car door shut with a heavy thud, sealing Marcus Reed inside the back seat. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the windshield of nearby cars, drawing more attention than the situation warranted. What had started as a minor shoplifting complaint had now transformed into something far more visible. Officer Daniel Mercer walked around to the driver's side, jaw tight, movements clipped and deliberate. Officer Luis Ortega remained standing on the sidewalk for a moment longer, scanning the crowd. Phones were still raised. Whispers moved like wind through the small gathering. "Let's clear out," Mercer called sharply. Nothing to see, but there was something to see, and everyone knew it. Ortega slid into the passenger seat. As Mercer started the engine, Ortega spoke carefully. "We could have let that go." Mercer didn't look at him. He challenged the stop. He asked a question. He was documenting. That's not obstruction. Mercer pulled into traffic without responding. The siren wasn't activated. This wasn't an emergency. It was a decision. In the back seat, Marcus sat upright despite the restraints. His breathing remained steady. He wasn't slouched or defeated. He looked forward, eyes calm, studying the reflections in the glass partition. After a moment he spoke. "Officer Mercer." Mercer's eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror. "You don't address me. You wait." "I'm not resisting," Marcus said evenly. "I'd just like clarification on the charge." You were interfering in an active investigation. By standing on a sidewalk, you were recording. In public. Mercer's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Ortega glanced back at Marcus. You understand this'll get sorted at the station. I'm sure it will, Marcus replied. That certainty landed strangely. They drove in silence for the next several blocks. Downtown buildings gave way to municipal structures. The police station came into view, grey concrete, sharp angles, institutional and unwelcoming. As Mercer parked in the secured intake area, he turned in his seat slightly to face Marcus. Here's how this works, Mercer said. You cooperate, answer questions, and maybe this stays simple. Marcus met his gaze through the metal partition. I have been cooperating, he replied calmly. Mercer opened the rear door and guided Marcus out. The metal cuffs clinked softly as they walked toward the station entrance. Ortega followed, quiet but observant. Inside, the fluorescent lighting was harsh. The front desk sergeant looked up briefly. What we got? The sergeant asked. Obstruction, Mercer answered. The sergeant glanced at Marcus. Interfered how? Recording and refusing to comply. Marcus spoke evenly. I requested clarification before providing identification. The sergeant studied him for a second longer than usual. It on him? Mercer hesitated. He didn't provide it. Marcus tilted his head slightly. I was about to. That detail hung in the air. The sergeant exhaled quietly. Put him in interview 2. We'll sort it. Mercer led Marcus down a narrow hallway. As they entered the small interview room, Mercer removed one cuff and secured it to the metal ring bolted to the table. Before stepping back, Mercer leaned slightly closer. You should have just walked away, he said. Marcus's expression didn't change. And you should have asked one more question. Marcus replied softly. Mercer straightened. For the first time since the stop began, a flicker of uncertainty passed through his expression. And somewhere beneath the sterile hum of the station lights, the momentum of the situation was quietly shifting. The interview room was silent, except for the low hum of fluorescent lights. Marcus Reed sat alone, one wrist secured to the metal ring on the table. He didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He waited. Outside the room, Officer Daniel Mercer stood at the duty desk, filling out preliminary paperwork. His report was short, confident, and firm in tone. Subject obstructed investigation, refused identification, created disturbance. Officer Luis Ortega leaned against the counter nearby, arms crossed. You sure about the wording? Ortega asked quietly. Mercer didn't look up. It's accurate. Is it complete? Mercer paused for half a second, then continued writing. It's what matters. At the far end of the hall, the desk sergeant, Sergeant Holloway, was reviewing intake logs when the station's main line rang. He picked it up absent-mindedly. Central District Station. There was a pause. Yes, he was brought in about 20 minutes ago. Another pause. Longer this time. Holloway's posture shifted. His tone became noticeably more formal. I see. Yes, sir. Understood. When he hung up, his expression had changed. He looked toward Mercer. Officer Mercer. My office. Now. Mercer straightened, mildly irritated. He handed the clipboard to Ortega and followed Holloway into the glass-walled office. What's this about? Mercer asked. Holloway closed the door behind them. Who exactly did you bring in? Name's Marcus Reed, Mercer replied. Was interfering with an arrest. Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. Did you run him? He didn't provide ID. And you didn't confirm before bringing him in? He was obstructing. Holloway stepped closer, lowering his voice. That obstructing subject, he said carefully, is part of a federally coordinated civil oversight task group. Mercer blinked once. What? He's attached to a documented field observation initiative. Independent Review Division. He wasn't random. Mercer's jaw tightened. So what? He was still interfering. Holloway held his gaze. There were federal monitors within 2 blocks when you detained him. Silence. Mercer processed that slowly. Ortega, standing outside, could see the tension building through the glass. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. Something was off. Inside the office, Mercer shook his head slightly. He never identified himself. Holloway replied evenly. He didn't have to. A knock came at the station entrance doors. Not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. Ortega turned instinctively. 2 individuals in plain clothes entered calm, professional, composed. One carried a leather portfolio. The other scanned the room without urgency. Ortega swallowed. He walked toward Holloway's office and knocked lightly. "Sergeant, you might want to step out." Holloway opened the door. He saw the 2 individuals immediately. The taller of the 2 stepped forward slightly. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "We're here regarding Mr. Reed." Mercer felt the air change. The situation he believed he controlled was no longer his. Holloway nodded once. "He's in interview room 2. The man gave a brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you." Mercer stepped forward instinctively. He obstructed a lawful investigation. The second individual opened the leather portfolio calmly. "We'll review the body camera footage," she said. "All of it." Mercer didn't respond. For the first time that day, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not authority, but exposure. Down the hallway, inside interview room 2, Marcus Reed sat quietly, waiting, and he already knew the knock had arrived. The station felt different now. Conversations had lowered. Movements were more measured. The 2 federal representatives stood calmly near the duty desk, while Sergeant Holloway retrieved the necessary access to the body camera archive. Officer Daniel Mercer stood a few feet away, arms folded tightly across his chest. His expression remained firm, but the certainty from earlier had begun to crack. "We'll need full footage," the taller representative said evenly, "from initial dispatch to transport." Holloway nodded. "You'll have it." Officer Luis Ortega avoided eye contact with Mercer. He had replayed the stop in his mind at least 5 times already. The tone, the escalation, the decision to cuff. It hadn't felt necessary. Inside the review room, the footage was pulled up on a large monitor. Mercer stood stiffly in the back. Holloway sat at the table with the 2 representatives. Ortega remained near the door. The video began. Body cam timestamp. 14 hours 32 minutes and 11 seconds. The scene unfolded exactly as it had hours earlier. The shoplifting suspect arguing. Mercer's voice raised. The crowd gathering. Then Marcus appeared on screen. Calm, hands visible, phone held at chest height. The room was silent except for Mercer's recorded voice. "Step back." On the screen, Marcus did step back. "Put the phone down. I'm documenting from a public sidewalk, officer." The representative paused the video. "Resume," she said. The footage continued. "Identify yourself. For what reason? You're interfering. How?" Pause. The representative leaned forward slightly. "Freeze it there." The frame stopped on Mercer's face. Jaw tight. Frustration clear. "Was there a lawful order issued?" she asked calmly. Mercer answered from behind them. "He was escalating the situation." The taller representative replied without turning around. "We're reviewing what occurred, not what was assumed." The footage played on. Marcus did not step forward. He did not shout. He did not resist. When Mercer grabbed his wrist, the video clearly showed Marcus's other hand remaining raised. "I'm not resisting." The audio was clean. The representative let the video continue all the way through the handcuffing and transport. No threats. No aggressive movements from Marcus. Just questions. When the screen went black, the silence in the room was heavier than before. Holloway exhaled slowly. The representative closed the laptop connected to the system. "Officer Mercer," she said evenly, At what point did Mr. Reed physically obstruct your investigation? Mercer hesitated. He was distracting from the arrest. Distraction is not obstruction, she replied. Ortega shifted uncomfortably near the door. The taller representative stood. Mr. Reed was assigned to observe field conduct interactions under community oversight authorization. His documentation was lawful. Mercer's voice was lower now. He could have identified himself. He was not required to. Those words landed firmly. Holloway looked at Mercer, not angrily, but disappointed. In this department, Holloway said quietly, we operate within policy. Outside the review room, word was already spreading. Officers avoided direct eye contact as Mercer stepped into the hallway. Inside interview room 2, Marcus remained seated, composed. The door opened. The representative entered first. Mr. Reed, she said calmly, you're free to go. Marcus stood slowly. I assumed that would be the case. As he walked past Mercer in the hallway, their eyes met for only a second. Marcus didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply said, quietly, authority is strongest when it's controlled. And this time Mercer had no reply. By the next morning, the station no longer felt routine. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Screens were turned away more quickly than usual. What had been an ordinary shift rotation was now overshadowed by a formal internal review. Officer Daniel Mercer sat alone in the administrative waiting area outside internal affairs. His uniform was pressed, posture straight, expression controlled. But beneath that stillness was calculation. He had replayed the incident repeatedly in his mind, searching for a moment he could justify something procedural he could lean on. Across the hallway, Officer Luis Ortega stood by the vending machine, staring at nothing in particular. He had been called to provide a statement as well. A door opened. Officer Mercer, a voice called. Mercer stood and walked into the review room. Inside sat Lieutenant Karen Doyle and a civilian oversight advisor. A recorder was placed at the center of the table. Have a seat, Doyle said calmly. Mercer complied. This is a formal review regarding yesterday's arrest of Mr. Marcus Reed, Doyle continued. You'll have an opportunity to explain your decision-making. Mercer nodded once. Understood. Doyle pressed record. Why did you escalate the interaction? Mercer's answer came prepared. The subject was recording at close proximity during an active arrest. I believed his presence could incite disruption. Did he verbally incite the crowd? No. Did he step into your physical working space? No. Did he refuse a lawful order? Mercer hesitated. He questioned it. Doyle held eye contact. Questioning an order is not refusal. Silence. Meanwhile, in a separate room, Ortega gave his own statement. Did Mr. Reed act aggressively? The investigator asked. No. Did he interfere physically? No. Did you believe handcuffing was necessary? Ortega paused. No, he said finally. I didn't. Back in Mercer's room, the oversight advisor slid a printed still image across the table. It was a freeze frame from the body camera footage. Marcus's hands visible, posture neutral. This image has been logged as part of the external oversight report, she said. Do you dispute what it shows? Mercer looked at it for several seconds. No. Doyle leaned back slightly. Officer Mercer, authority carries discretion. Discretion requires restraint. Yesterday, restraint was absent. Mercer's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Outside the room, officers moved through the hallway more quietly than usual. The event had rippled outward. It wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about perception, trust, judgment. When Mercer exited the review room, he saw Ortega standing near the lockers. Their eyes met. You said it wasn't necessary, Mercer stated quietly. Ortega didn't look away. Because it wasn't. That was the first honest exchange between them. Later that afternoon, a department-wide email was circulated. Pending investigation, Officer Daniel Mercer is reassigned to administrative duty. Not suspension. Not termination, but not patrol. Mercer read it alone at his desk. Across town, Marcus Reed reviewed the official transcript of the review session. He didn't celebrate. He didn't comment publicly. He simply documented. Because exposure was never about humiliation. It was about accountability. And accountability had just begun. By mid-morning, the atmosphere in the station had shifted entirely. Conversations were hushed, and the usual rhythm of paperwork and radio chatter seemed slower, almost cautious. Officer Daniel Mercer felt it before he understood why a quiet tension permeated the air, like the calm before a storm he hadn't anticipated. In interview room 2, Marcus Reed sat calmly at the metal table, wrists still lightly resting on the ring of the cuffs. He had been cleared temporarily from physical restraint, but his presence alone commanded attention. Outside the room, Mercer adjusted his tie, trying to mask the unease that had been creeping in since the arrival of the federal representatives. A knock echoed sharply against the door. Mercer instinctively tensed. "Enter," Marcus called evenly. The door opened to reveal Captain Elaine Harper, flanked by 2 federal oversight officers in plain clothes. One of them carried a leather portfolio. The other had a tablet displaying multiple camera feeds. Their presence was quiet but authoritative, and the way they moved suggested control without force. "Mr. Reed," Captain Harper said, her tone polite but deliberate. "We've reviewed the preliminary reports from yesterday's incident." Marcus nodded slightly. "I assumed you would." Harper turned her gaze to Mercer. "Officer Mercer, we need to clarify several points regarding your engagement with Mr. Reed." Mercer straightened, voice firm but defensive. "I followed protocol. The subject was interfering." Harper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Interfering?" She gestured to the tablet. "By standing on a public sidewalk and documenting a lawful arrest?" Mercer swallowed. It seemed potentially disruptive. The federal officer holding the tablet tapped lightly. A series of timestamps appeared, showing the entire encounter from multiple angles. The footage played. Marcus standing calmly, hands visible, phone recording at chest height. He had not resisted, argued aggressively, or physically engaged. His only actions had been observing and questioning politely. The room fell silent. Mercer's jaw tightened. Captain Harper spoke again, her tone measured. "Officer Mercer, Mr. Reed is part of a federally sanctioned civil rights oversight operation. His assignment includes observing interactions with law enforcement and documenting behavior for accountability purposes." Mercer blinked. He was assigned to observe?" "Yes," Harper confirmed. "He was documenting according to federal oversight protocols. Any use of force against him would now be under internal and federal review." The weight of the revelations sank into Mercer. The calm demeanor, the measured responses, the unshakable poise, it all made sense now. Marcus had never acted impulsively. He had never broken the law. Yet Mercer's assumptions, his unchecked authority, had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Marcus remained seated, composed, as if observing Mercer's realization. "Authority is most effective when exercised with restraint," he said quietly. Mercer felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Words failed him. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but the clarity of the evidence left no room for argument. Captain Harper stepped closer. "Officer Mercer, this is not just about one incident. It's a lesson in procedure, discretion, and accountability. Your actions will be reviewed, and appropriate measures will follow." Marcus stood slowly, hands relaxed at his sides. He nodded once at Mercer, not with condescension, but with a quiet authority that reminded Mercer of the true meaning of discipline and responsibility. The room, once charged with tension and anger, now carried a different energy, the calm certainty of truth prevailing over unchecked power. Outside the window, The city continued its rhythm, oblivious to the quiet revelation that had just reshaped the dynamics of authority within the station walls. Mercer remained standing, staring at the empty seat Marcus had left behind. For the first time in years, he understood that control was not about force. It was about knowing when and when not to use it. The aftermath of the revelation hung heavy over the station. Officer Daniel Mercer sat at a corner desk in the administrative wing, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. The usual hum of keyboards and muted conversations felt distant, almost foreign. Every movement of officers around him seemed amplified, each glance toward him carrying subtle judgment. He was aware that whispers followed him through the hallways, that the incident had spread faster than he could control. Across the station, Officer Luis Ortega observed from a distance. He had been called in again to provide a supplemental statement to Internal Affairs, detailing the escalation from his perspective. He remained composed, but he could sense the tension radiating from Mercer, who had been operating on confidence and ego for years. Now, that confidence was slipping. Captain Elaine Harper had already begun formal debriefings with federal oversight officials. They reviewed every step: the initial stop, Mercer's interactions with Marcus Reed, and the handling of bystanders. Each frame of body camera footage told a story that contradicted Mercer's account. The first meeting with Internal Affairs was tense. Lieutenant Karen Doyle opened the session with a direct question. "Officer Mercer, at what point did you consider that Mr. Reed might not be a threat?" Mercer shifted uncomfortably. He seemed calm, but I assumed there could be escalation. "Assumptions are not policy," Doyle replied. "Your responsibility is to assess behavior, not project threat." Every word felt heavier than the last. The room was quiet except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. The federal representatives present didn't speak, only observing, occasionally making notes. Mercer realized that his authority, once absolute in his mind, had become fragile under scrutiny. Back in the hall, officers whispered among themselves. The mood was tense. Some avoided eye contact with Mercer entirely. Others glanced with curiosity and unspoken judgment. Even the dispatcher seemed more cautious when relaying information to him. Mercer was asked to provide a written statement detailing every action he took and why. His handwriting, usually precise and confident, wavered slightly. Words that once felt self-assured now carried weight he hadn't anticipated. Every sentence had to reconcile with the undeniable evidence from body cameras and federal documentation. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed's calm, collected approach was being validated. He had followed protocol perfectly. He had allowed the law to operate without obstruction. Mercer's assumptions and aggressive behavior had now become the focal point of the review. The first signs of collapse were subtle but unmistakable. Mercer's usual decisiveness was replaced by hesitation. His commands were second-guessed internally. His judgment was questioned, not only by his peers but by the system he had believed was behind him unconditionally. By late afternoon, word came down. Mercer would be temporarily reassigned to administrative duty, pending a full investigation. Patrol was no longer his domain. The weight of exposure had shifted the balance entirely. Ortega, walking past Mercer in the hallway, spoke quietly, almost under his breath. "Sometimes power is strongest when restrained." Mercer didn't reply. He simply stared at the floor, understanding for the first time that authority without accountability was not strength. It was vulnerability. Outside the station windows, the city moved on, oblivious to the collapse that had occurred inside. But inside the walls, lessons had been etched permanently. Unchecked force, assumptions, and ego could crumble under scrutiny, leaving even the most confident officers exposed and humbled. For Mercer, the authority he had wielded so effortlessly for years was now fragile, measured, and above all, accountable. The following week was dominated by the slow, methodical rhythm of an internal investigation. Officer Daniel Mercer had been reassigned to administrative duties, a quiet corner office where his interactions with colleagues were limited to official statements and procedural briefings. The station, once a familiar environment where he moved with confidence, now felt suffocating every glance and whisper amplified by the recent events. Lieutenant Karen Doyle coordinated the investigation, ensuring that every procedural step was followed to the letter. She reviewed body camera footage, radio logs, and officer reports, cross-referencing them with federal oversight documentation. Each piece of evidence painted a consistent picture. Marcus Reed had behaved lawfully, calmly, and without provocation. Mercer's response, while perhaps instinctual, had been disproportionate. Mercer was summoned repeatedly for formal interviews. Each session was structured, documented, and precise. He answered questions about every movement, every decision, and every verbal exchange. His responses were confident in tone, but lacked the authority they once carried. The investigators didn't respond emotionally, they focused on the facts. Every recorded movement, every decision made during the stop, was analyzed and logged. Outside the interview rooms, Officer Luis Ortega observed quietly. He had provided his statement early in the process, confirming what he had witnessed. Marcus had not resisted, had not engaged physically, and had complied with all reasonable requests, save for the voluntary provision of identification. Ortega watched Mercer struggle with the reality of scrutiny. News of the investigation had started to reach the local precincts. Rumors circulated, quietly at first, then more openly. Some officers offered subtle support, while others avoided Mercer entirely. The once clear boundary of authority was now blurred, replaced by accountability measures and oversight protocols. Mercer realized that reputation alone could no longer shield him from consequences. Federal oversight agents visited the station intermittently, reviewing reports and comparing them to operational guidelines. Their presence added a silent pressure, a constant reminder that the incident had attracted attention beyond the local level. The protocols Mercer had relied on for years were being tested against an impartial standard. At one point, Mercer was asked to provide a personal statement explaining why he had escalated the interaction. He attempted to justify it, citing assumptions and perceived risk, but the evidence contradicted every claim. Doyle listened carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally pausing to annotate the transcript. The investigation also uncovered a pattern. Mercer's record showed prior minor complaints regarding aggressive engagement during stops, each resolved without consequence. The cumulative effect was clear. Unchecked behavior had persisted over time, and Marcus Reed's encounter had merely exposed it. Meanwhile, Marcus remained largely absent from public attention, reviewing transcripts and documentation quietly. He allowed the system to process, never intervening beyond necessary procedural responses. His calm, measured approach contrasted sharply with Mercer's defensive posture, highlighting the difference between authority wielded responsibly and authority abused. By the end of the week, Doyle compiled her preliminary report. It concluded that Mercer's actions had violated protocol and suggested disciplinary measures. Mercer read it in stunned silence. For the first time, he fully comprehended the consequences of acting impulsively, of allowing ego and assumption to dictate behavior. Accountability had arrived not as a single moment, but as a systematic, undeniable process. Mercer would have to face it, and the department would have to reckon with the lessons his actions had revealed. In the halls of the station, the message was clear. Authority without restraint was no longer acceptable. The station's atmosphere had grown tense, heavy with the weight of judgment and scrutiny. Officer Daniel Mercer, once confident in his authority, now walked the hallways cautiously, aware that every step, Every glance might be noted or questioned. The reassignment to administrative duty had insulated him from patrol responsibilities, but it had also placed him squarely under the microscope of internal affairs and federal oversight. Lieutenant Karen Doyle scheduled a meeting with Mercer in one of the larger conference rooms. The room's long table and neutral lighting emphasized formality, stripping away any comfort Mercer might have hoped to find. He entered, greeted only by a nod from Doyle, and took a seat at the head of the table. Across from him sat Marcus Reed, accompanied by one of the federal oversight representatives. Marcus did not rise or bow. He simply acknowledged Mercer with a calm, steady gaze. His composure was intentional, an unspoken assertion of order and presence. Mercer cleared his throat. I understand that you were assigned to observe," Mercer began, voice cautious. "But you never identified yourself." Marcus's gaze did not waver. "I was observing under federal authorization. Identification was not required until necessary. My objective was to ensure transparency and accountability." Ortega, who had been called in to witness the discussion, noted the subtle power shift. For the first time, Mercer was on the defensive. Every word he spoke was measured, but he felt the ground beneath him shift as Marcus's quiet authority filled the room. "Officer Mercer," the federal representative said, "your actions have been documented. The body camera footage, witness accounts, and procedural review demonstrate that Mr. Reed complied fully. Your escalation was unnecessary." Mercer clenched his jaw. "I followed what I believed was protocol. I thought he was interfering. I thought—" "You thought," Marcus interrupted softly. "But thinking alone does not authorize force. Observation and documentation are not obstruction. Authority is most effective when restrained." The words cut through Mercer more sharply than he expected. They were not confrontational, they were precise. Each syllable carried the weight of undeniable logic. Mercer had been challenged, and for the first time he realized that logic, not force, determined legitimacy. Doyle interjected, "This is not about humiliation. It's about accountability. Your behavior created a risk to the department and to yourself. The escalation could have had serious consequences." Mercer exhaled slowly, looking down at the polished conference table. He had believed control was maintained through confidence and force. Now he understood that the absence of restraint was the true vulnerability. Marcus leaned slightly forward. "Officer Mercer, the objective is not to undermine your role. It is to ensure that authority is exercised responsibly. The public, your colleagues, and the law itself demand it." Ortega watched Mercer's reaction closely. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of acknowledgement, of acceptance. Mercer's eyes met Marcus's one last time. No words, no argument, only recognition. The meeting ended shortly after, leaving Mercer alone with his thoughts. The confrontation had stripped away pretense and pride, revealing the stark reality. Authority is not a shield against scrutiny. It is a responsibility that demands self-awareness and discipline. As he walked back to his temporary desk, Mercer realized that the lessons of the past week were not abstract. They were concrete, unavoidable, and transformative. For the first time, he began to understand that leadership required restraint, observation, and accountability, not assumption, fear, or force. Outside the station, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding within its walls. But inside, the confrontation had left an indelible mark on both the officer and the system he served. The final chapter of the ordeal began with a quiet, measured rhythm. Officer Daniel Mercer had spent weeks under administrative reassignment, his confidence eroded, his assumptions scrutinized. The internal review had concluded, the federal oversight team had submitted their detailed report, and the department had reached its decisions regarding policy, accountability, and discipline. Mercer had been ordered to attend a series of mandatory training sessions, on procedural compliance, de-escalation, and accountability. The morning was crisp, sunlight streaming through the blinds of the small conference room where Mercer was meeting Lieutenant Karen Doyle and Sergeant Holloway. Marcus Reed was also present, though his presence was calm, almost ceremonial. He had arrived not to intimidate, but to ensure the final review remained thorough and transparent. "Officer Mercer," Doyle began, "the department recognizes that authority is not simply about action. It is about discretion, assessment, and responsibility. The events of the past weeks have been instructive for the entire team." Mercer nodded, though his posture was tense. He felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever before. "Understood," he said simply. Marcus spoke next, his voice steady and even. "This was never about personal judgment or retribution. Transparency and accountability ensure that the law serves the people fairly. My role is not to punish, but to document and confirm compliance with lawful procedures." Mercer swallowed, acknowledging the gravity of Marcus's words. I see that now," he admitted. "I acted too quickly, assumed too much, and failed to consider alternative approaches." Ortega, present as a witness, offered a small nod. "We've all learned from this," he said quietly. "The system works when checks are in place, but personal restraint is essential." The federal oversight officer added, "The recordings, statements, and documentation show that Mr. Reed complied fully and lawfully. The department has implemented changes to ensure future interactions are guided by evidence-based procedures." Mercer exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen. He realized that authority without accountability was fragile, and that true professional growth came from understanding the consequences of one's decisions and actions. Marcus stood, collecting his papers. "Officer Mercer," he said quietly, "authority is strongest when tempered with patience and consideration. Today demonstrates that restraint is a form of strength." Mercer met his gaze. For the first time in weeks, he felt clarity. "I understand," he said, voice steady but reflective. "I will carry this forward. I'll apply it to my work and my decisions." The meeting concluded with a formal acknowledgement from Doyle. Policies were updated, officers were briefed, and Mercer was given the option to return to active duty once training was completed. The lesson was clear. Authority comes with accountability, and oversight ensures that the law is enforced with integrity. As Marcus departed, Mercer remained seated for a moment, reflecting on the entire sequence of events. From a routine stop to a federal intervention, the experience had reshaped his understanding of law enforcement, leadership, and professional responsibility. Outside the building, the city moved on, indifferent yet constant. But inside the walls of the station, one officer had been tested, humbled, and ultimately transformed. Authority, Mercer realized, was not measured by compliance extracted through force, but by the restraint exercised in every decision. For the first time, he left the station not with a sense of control, but with understanding. He had been challenged, exposed, and corrected, and in that, he found the foundation of true authority, tempered, accountable, and fair. The lesson was indelible, the transformation irreversible, and the responsibility absolute.